Surveillance states are expanding, and the courts aren't helping. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic. This is your deep dive of the week. Now, I'm going to read this blurb here about what's going on because, quite frankly, this, I think, is the backdrop for something that's a whole lot worse and is getting worse. So with that, thank you, CISO Series, for this quick write-up, but a federal judge upheld Norfolk, Virginia's use of 176 flock automated license plate reader cameras, rejecting claims they amount to unconstitutional warrantless surveillance. The court ruled the network is too sparse to reveal a whole, quote-unquote, picture of someone's movements, contrasting it with mobile phone tracking and aerial surveillance cases. The Institute for Justice, which brought this suit, plans to appeal as other cities end flock contracts over privacy concerns. Now, I think that this is really indicative of the time that we are living in right now. We are living in an expansion of surveillance states thanks to the expansion of technology in general, and oftentimes the lack of solid privacy laws that we can wrap around these things. So let's dive into this specific ruling because I think this ruling is narrow and it's not, for the record, a blanket approval of mass surveillance, which, okay, we can take that both ways. But a federal judge upheld Norfolk's use of flock safety cameras because the network was deemed too limited to reconstruct a full person's movement. But that decision hinges basically on both scale and aggregation. And that's what I think the judge missed. So the court explicitly distinguished sparse fixed cameras from continuous tracking methods like mobile phone location data, aerial surveillance, and all of that. But the implications are deeply disturbing to me because not constitutional, quote unquote, does not equal low risk. Camera density is going to increase. We all know this. We're spinning them up outside of flock in every which way, shape, or form. And that also means data retention expands, and these systems are integrated with other data sets. And we'll get to that in a minute here. This judge, in my opinion, totally missed the mark. It really did. So let's think long term here, because aggregation is a real risk multiplier here. Even benign point-in-time data can become sensitive surveillance when combined across locations or time or third-party sharing, and on and on and on. Appeals and contract terminations, basically in this case, signal instability, meaning as the cities are essentially getting rid of these cameras, there is a debate going on as to surveillance. Look at San Francisco, look at Oakland, and some of the other cities that have started removing basically these closed-circuit television that monitor their citizens because we historically haven't really needed it. And here we are. Now, the Institute of Justice, the one that brought the suit, they plan to appeal, as I mentioned, and other municipalities are already ending contracts over privacy concerns. This is not settled, though, and it shouldn't be. But let's think about all of these cases where the U.S. government in particular, because that's where what we're talking about here. Let's talk about all the cases where the U.S. government has gotten access to footage under dubious, at best sometimes, legal circumstances that could fill in the blanks, basically for the government on where a flock camera isn't present. In other words, we can already supplement flock with other technologies, and that is something I think the judge really missed. So let's start basically in the modern technological era all the way back in 2000. I've done my homework. Now, back then, there was a case on the 10th Circuit, the United States v. Jackson. And in this case, the FBI used video cameras installed on telephone poles outside of residence. Now, why this is considered dubious, essentially, is that long-term duration video monitoring from public infrastructure without a traditional warrant process essentially is tailored. It's just tailored to continuous recording of who we are. In 2009, on the Fourth Circuit, there was the United States versus Vankensteren. Basically, officers installed a motion-activated camera on a property in a quote-unquote open field without a warrant. Now, that's dubious because open fields as a doctrine essentially let the government capture video on private land, not the home itself, but they can do this without a warrant. And in 2018, this was essentially the start of a large-scale police partnership to solicit private doorbell footage, ring neighbors, basically started this era. And if you are a longtime listener or follower of mine, you know I've talked about the ills of Ring before they were bought, by Amazon. Full disclosure, they actually tried to have and successfully had one of my articles that I had written for Forbes changed, as a result of all of this. Ring formalized back then in 2018, basically the neighbors police partnerships, and that was starting around March of 2018 per reporting. And obviously this is very dubiously, it's not necessarily illegal, but it created a structured pipeline for police and law enforcement to ask residents for footage at scale, oftentimes without warrants, right? Because it's framed as voluntary sharing. In 2019, police departments responding to all of this with Amazon Ring started offering Amazon Ring devices as incentives for information. Therefore, this is encouraging wider deployment and easier evidence collection via the neighbors workflow that Amazon had put together. Now this obviously blurs the line between public law enforcement objectives and building a private surveillance footprint that later basically became very easy for investigators to simply tap into. As I've talked about before, essentially what we have here is Amazon has helped to build one of the largest surveillance states on the planet by utilizing our desire to basically have doorbell cameras for our own safety and security. That's absolutely crazy. In 2021, there was a Seventh Circuit judgment, United States v. Tuggle. The court upheld 18 months of continuous poll camera surveillance of a home's exterior from public vantage points. That's obviously dubious because critics argued that this would enable a drag-like mosaic, quote-unquote, surveillance of home life without any kind of judicial oversight. This is where we've been heading. And it gets worse. In 2022, also, the First Circuit Court had United States v. Moore Bush, and basically that was surveillance that ran for around 8 months or so, and that was an intense split reasoning on whether long-term poll camera monitoring should be treated like a search. The suppression was ultimately not granted by the court. And this shows how even when judges find it invasive, defendants can lose essentially on doctrinal technicalities, good faith reliance as an example, right? In 2022, Amazon acknowledged Ring provided footage to law enforcement without user consent and without basically a warrant in quote-unquote emergency requests. There were reported 11 incidents in 2022 at the time. Obviously, that's Amazon plus the police effectively deciding what qualifies an emergency, bypassing a judge. These are things that, again, start to erode that right to privacy, that constitutional system the United States has. In 2022, Google, through its Nest system, basically got into the play with emergency disclosures as well. They basically created a pathway for warrantless access to their infrastructure. Reporting described Google Nest policy as allowing quote-unquote emergency disclosures to police without a warrant. That was contrasted with vendors saying they require warrants, court orders, and all of that. So now you've got Ring with a massive surveillance state. Google Nest also massive surveillance state integration with basically a method to allow the police to get access without actually having a warrant. In 2023, the ACLU noted the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review a challenge involving that 8 months of 24/7 poll camera surveillance without a warrant. That leaves basically a patchwork where long-term video surveillance may proceed without warrants in many jurisdictions. That should be of deep concern to anybody that's listening or watching this. That's a huge, huge problem. In 2024, Ring ended the neighbor's quote-unquote request for assistance feature that let police request footage, but coverage emphasized that Ring still could share in emergencies and police still could basically use this essentially via warrants and subpoenas. But whatever constitutes that emergency is now up to Amazon for the most part. Even after removing that overt solicitation feature, the emergency warrantless path is still there. This is a huge issue that we have. In 2025, literally last year, less than a year ago, unmarked surveillance cameras on utility poles were aimed at activist homes, and agencies, federal agencies, denied the knowledge that they existed. This is surveillance targeting of First Amendment activity and a lack of transparency about the authorization therein. That's a huge problem. That should be concerning to anybody that believes in the law. In 2025, Ring resumed allowing police to request footage and then tied it to a partnership with Axon, which is a digital evidence ecosystem. So Amazon just rebuilds a scalable request pipeline. Even if it's voluntary, it normalizes routine law enforcement pulls from privately owned cameras. And we all have cameras. We've seen what's going on with the protests and all of that. I like to say that cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. And this is exactly why. We have privacy issues. And in 2025 as well, Consumer Reporting and Local Journalism described Ring's launching and using of community requests, enabling police to request video via app workflows. That kind of is a successor mechanism from the 2024 situation I was talking about. And that's dubious because functionality creates the high volume request channel, but it simply just has different mechanics and different branding. But it's the same thing. And the piece de resistance here, where the judge in this case on Flock completely missed the mark, comes from 2025 because Ring integrated with Flock, and it allows requests basically from both of them through a combined surveillance platform ecosystem. The Flock Safety Partnership is basically described as letting agencies use Flock platforms to request Ring footage through Ring's programs. This literally stitches together private home cameras with broader police surveillance platforms. So it increases the scale and it reduces the friction that they have, aka go get a warrant, for looking at this information. And this is what the judge is ruling on, that Flock is sparse and siloed into itself, but it is now combined with Ring. And so where Flock leaves off in surveillance, if I'm walking across Norfolk, Virginia, or anywhere else, is that where Flock leaves off, Ring can potentially keep up. This is a huge thing. This is obviously insane. If I can find this information this quickly to put together a deep dive, they can too. A judge can too. And so finally, I want to be clear here. I want to be incredibly clear. I think this new ruling does not greenlight broad surveillance. It actually kind of rewards restraint. But the more comprehensive the picture that we in the privacy world, the privacy wonks can build, the higher the risk and higher the legal and reputational risk becomes. And I think that's super, super important. That means that essentially we have a better chance to thwart this as long as we have a fair legal system to adjudicate it. We are seeing privacy go in the wrong way. Now, I was recently on CISO Series podcast, and I was talking exactly about this, not as in depth because, you have a certain amount of times per segment. And the other guest on there, Steve, who I deeply, deeply respect. He's a brilliant cybersecurity cybersecurity information officer. I'm discombobulated right now because this really grinds my gears. But Steve had a really good point in the sense that, we also have reasons why we would want surveillance. And his example was, why wouldn't we want a Flock camera to catch the license plate of the car we know that abducted the child and all of that? And I think that's a very valid point. I hear that point quite a bit. But we also have this tendency to build laws and create laws, one, reactionary, and most democratic systems do this because they are slow to basically execute on laws, but we also make laws to the lowest common denominator, meaning essentially what we have here is the vast majority of us, 99.999% of us, are law-abiding citizens. We are not committing crimes. We're not robbing stores or kicking in doors in homes or kidnapping children or whatever that is. And while those are important things, statistically speaking, do we break our encryption? Do we let ourselves be surveilled basically just to catch the 0.001% of what is happening when traditionally, it's always been cat and mouse with police or law enforcement versus criminals. And when the police are on it and they're focused, they've not needed this technology before. These are things that I think we need to essentially adjudicate. There are no absolutes here. But the point is, we're moving in the wrong direction towards just having privacy that you and I can essentially have that isn't interfered with and intruded on. And think about the footage that you're storing with Amazon Ring. It's being stored in Amazon data centers. They don't need to technically tell you that they can access this. And Ring has a large history of having their employees, even before Amazon, with the ability to access all of this Ring footage, not to mention everything else. This is a huge problem. And so with that, I'm going to leave it there, but I think we're heading in the wrong direction. I think it really is time to start focusing on hardening our privacy, because quite frankly, that right to privacy has been eroding in the technological era and before then. But what dropped a supercharger into this was the ability for the police to pull Google searches through essentially blanket warrants geographically, as well as other systems and standards as well, pulling data from Facebook, all of that. It's a huge thing. And now it's surveillance, now it's cameras. So there you go. That is your deep dive of the week. And quite frankly, we're going to need all the help we can get out here. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, 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 I don't want to say private, secure, and informed. Take care.